Python exceptions. Currently, with our coding, we get an error or an exception that causes our program will crash when we get an error. Exception handling allows a program to detect errors, handle them, and, even better yet, continues to run. So exceptions use a try and accept block. Errors can be handled with these try and accept statements. The code that could potentially have an error is placed in a try clause, and the execution moves to the beginning of the accept clause if an error occurs. So here's an example. Up here at the top you see our code executing successfully. We retrieved a prompt from a program, but let's say we put the wrong port number in. And now we're going to get some type of error and our program crashes. So we want to stop that. We want to tell our code what to do. And the complete exception text is going to be huge. There's a lot of stuff in here. So you'll have to kind of sift through it to find what your exception is. Well, let's take a look at exception handling, and then we'll move on to how to read the full text. So in this example, we're declaring some global variables, and then we've actually got the same variable, so we're going to actually reassign Palo Alto from 4 to 12 if we call this function, and we are going to return total. Well, the problem we have here is at line 12, we haven't called the function total devices, so there's no scope for total. As far as the program is concerned, total doesn't exist globally, so that code is going to fail. And if you look here at the code execution, program crashes, total is not defined. So if we put this in a try and accept clause, calling the name error, and actually if you go back here to your exception error, you see that it's a name error, so that's the exception we're going to catch. So we're going to try total, and we know that's not going to work because we get an invalid scope. And then we're going to execute some other code to get some numbers. And then just for good measure, I put at line 21 print done, so I can see that I'm actually skipping from line 12 to line 18 to print this error message. And then at line 21 we print done, and now our code executes. So now if we want to do some other stuff, let's look back at this other example. I tried all of this. So what happens here is, as soon as I get to this error message, I skip straight to 18, and then we move on. Doing it this way is an example of, if I do my try block and this fails, I'm going to pull the name error exception, and then the rest of my code will execute, and you see that here as we see these values being printed. Now here's an example of an error message from an invalid IP address, and you're going to get a lot of different, there's probably 2 pages here, you're not seeing all of it, but what you're going to be looking for is, here we see this NetMiko timeout exception. So now that we know what the error is, we can create an exception clause for it. Hopefully, as you get more into coding, you will know what exceptions to have, but if you get an error, then you can fix it by creating an exception for that specific error that your program did. And if you do good testing of your programs, which includes both executing it correctly and giving it invalid data, you should see these exceptions, and then you can create exception clauses to handle what the error is. So here's some more. This is probably page 2 of that first authentication error, and we see a NetMiko authentication exception. We also see a Paramiko SSH exception, authentication exception. Remember, I don't know if we mentioned this, but NetMiko relies on another module called Paramiko. We don't have to install it because when you install NetMiko, the Paramiko module gets installed anyway. But the point of that is we can just focus on the NetMiko authentication message. So here's an example of a catch-all exception. So if for some reason something fails, the catch-all exception is great. And basically what this does is any exception, I'm going to call it E, and then I can print undefined exception. add a new line character to it, and then I will print the exception itself. But the exception is not a string, it's an exception object. So we have to convert it to a string for this to work. So here's an example of it executing, and it did indeed print an undefined exception, because we don't realize the generic catch-all exception, we don't know what it is. And then it said the authentication of the device failed, and it converted that message to a string, and it printed it, and it actually did execute that our program is still running. So let's go back to here and take a look at it. So it did actually catch the exception, it printed that text, created a new line, and then it printed the actual output of that exception. And there it is again. Now, if we want more clarity in our exceptions, or maybe we want our program to do different things based on what exception they get. So instead of just using the generic exception, we can create a catch clause for the NetMiko timeout exception. And when this happens, we're going to write a different message. Maybe we're going to write this to a log file. Maybe we'll send an email. We can do anything we want to in this code block. And then we're going to print the timeout value right there. We're going to print the actual exception named timeout. So here's an example of this executing. So we create the timeout exception, we give it a name, then we can reference this later with printing the string timeout. And the example here, if we gave the wrong IP address or port number, we get this message, a timeout exception occurred while logging into IP and the port number. And then we see the actual error message text also. We can import more than just the timeout exception, so this is probably the best way. The two most common exceptions that you'll use with this, we could get a timeout exception, we could get an authentication exception, and then lastly, we probably want the generic exception. So if something happens that's unexpected, we do get a message and we can actually see that exception text.